Hello everyone, I am Viktarak Datta. I am a member of the Speaking Archaeological Research Wing, and today I'm going to present on the religious landscape of Neo-Sumerian Mesopotamia. This is a part of the Mesopotamian archaeology course that we have been doing at Speaking Archaeologically, and the Neo-Sumerian is one phase in the history of Mesopotamia. So for the introduction, um, the area of Mesopotamia and the geography of Mesopotamia is very important in order to understand what was happening in Bronze Age Mesopotamia and why things were happening in a certain way. Now, this is a zoomed in map of modern day Iraq, and you can see the land between the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates. This is the area or the geographical locale that became the center of an important Bronze Age civilization, roughly from around the early 4th millennium BC, and more specifically from the 3rd millennium BC onwards. And geographically speaking, they can be divided into northern Mesopotamia and southern Mesopotamia. Northern Mesopotamia and southern Mesopotamia were geographically different areas. Although the general summers in these areas are harsh and hot, and temperatures are generally above 50 degrees Celsius with heavy torrential rainfall, southern Mesopotamia receives comparatively less rainfall than northern Mesopotamia. However, the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, especially the river Euphrates, brings a lot of fertile silt and soil on the banks of southern Mesopotamia. And that is one of the primary reasons why small urban centers came to be established here from around the 4th millennium BCE. So cities like Ur, Lagash, um, Nippur, and Kish, these came up along the banks of the important rivers here. And that is what then later on became more complex political formations and the center of what we call the earliest empires of the ancient world. The period that we are looking at is the Neo-Sumerian period, which is roughly around 2112 BCE to 2004 BCE. This is associated with the rule of the kings of the third dynasty of Ur. So, as the name suggests, Ur became the center of power and political importance in this period. And it also became an important center from where political control was exercised over peripheral areas. Now, to understand and study the religious landscape of the Neo-Sumerian period, we have three main categories of sources. One is that we have an extensive volume of inscribed tablets and what we call literary sources. So there is no literary texts as manuscripts, but we have a lot of inscribed clay tablets and inscriptions as king lists. Secondly, we have some iconographic sources. So there are these votive sculptures and small foundational figures that we will come across in later in the presentation. And we also have structural remains. So we have shrines, remains of ziggurats, and other such structural remains which tell us the kind of urban complexes and the kind of settlement patterns that were prevalent in these times. Now, a little bit introduction to Mesopotamian religion. Now, a fair warning here that when I use the term Mesopotamian religion, this is a term that is used in modern day English, but as such, there is nothing called a complex or unified system of religion in Mesopotamia. And so we do not even have a word that perfectly translates into religion in ancient Sumerian or Akkadian languages. The Sumerian word for deities is Dingir, which is indicated by by the cuneiform sign of a star, whereas the Akkadian word is Ilam for god and Iltum for the goddess. Now, the Akkadian influences were more Semitic in nature. So, roughly northern Mesopotamia corresponds to Akkadian cultural zone, whereas southern Mesopotamia is also known as Sumerian, which is something that will help us in future when we're looking into the history of Mesopotamia. Now, the religious pantheon was largely polytheistic in nature. So there were a number of deities who were hierarchically organized. Some were more powerful, others were considered to be less powerful. Later on, around the late second millennium BC, we see certain henotheistic features coming up in the religion and in the pantheon itself. Now, certain deities would act as patron deities of certain cities. So, for example, Ur would have a patron deity of its own, such as Nannar. Similarly, Lagash would have a patron deity of its own, or Nippur would have a patron deity of its own. Now, in the third millennium BC, the chief and the most important deities were Nannar, Enlil, An, Ninhursaka, and all these deities represented some natural force or some element of nature. So, for example, Nannar represented moon and An stood for the sky. Remember that the names of these deities here are in Sumerian and they have Akkadian counterparts. So, for example, An was known by another name in Akkadian. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. However, iconographic representation of deities come only from the third millennium BCE. Now we do find deities in seals and cylinder seals for the first time. However, although these contain certain colophons underneath and certain labels, but these are not exactly the names of the deities, so to speak. And that creates certain problems for archaeologists because we try to interpret and identify deities based on names that are available to us from a later period. So, for example, a lot of literary sources recording the names of deities come up only from the late third millennium and from the second millennium BC. So, when we try to interpret the deities based on names that are coming much later, obviously there is a disjunction between the two. And here we also need to remember that most of the deities were iconographically identified by certain symbols. So, for example, the moon would be represented for Nannar if Nannar is not shown in an anthropomorphic figure. Similarly, we would have certain symbols associated with certain deities. So, a horned helmet or a horned headdress would resemble someone or identify someone as a deity. Now, for our convenience, there is a scheme, a developmental scheme that was given by Thorkel Jacobsen, where he divided the development of Mesopotamian religion into three phases. So the earliest phases in the fourth millennium is when we see the natural forces are very important. So the sun, the moon, all the forces of nature, which are very furious to the people, are worshipped. The third millennium BCE is a period when deities are imagined as just and powerful rulers. Now, the earliest deities were the ones who were very powerful. So they were not worshipped because they were good or bad or virtuous, but because they were powerful and had to be venerated. But from the third millennium BC, there is a concept that the deity is a just ruler, and the ruler on earth is also the person who is supposed to protect the subjects and the people. So there is a connection between the deity and the political representative on earth who is the ruler. And from the second millennium, we come across more of henotheistic elements, more of individual gods and their cults emerging. Now, this is a very simplistic developmental schema, and I would not suggest this to be followed very devotedly because, and this is pretty old in 1976, but this kind of systematization helps us in understanding at a beginner level. Now we start with the Neo-Sumerian period. So as I already said, this is the period of the third dynasty of Ur. And the first king that we know of is Ur-Nammu, who established Ur as his political capital, and he slowly expanded the political horizons of the third dynasty. So there were certain peripheral cities like Mari and Simanom, which were located on either banks of the rivers, and these were the peripheries from where resources were effectively extracted, and princes were married into the royal family, and tributary relations were established. Ur-Nammu was succeeded by Shulgi, and later on we have the rulers Amarsuan, Shusien, and Ibisuan. Now, under the later rulers, especially from the time of Amarsuan, We see Amorite invasions happening from the west and Elamite attacks from the east. And this is what brings an end to the Neo-Sumerian period, or there is a sack of Ur and a massive destruction of the city. Now, Neo-Sumerian religion consists of ziggurats. So ziggurat is, so to speak, the most visible architectural and structural remnant of the religious landscape that we can see. We don't have ziggurats surviving in their complete form, at least from the Neo-Sumerian period. And we only have the huge foundations of the ziggurats. Another important thing was that while temples and shrines were being dedicated to deities from the early dynastic period, we saw in the early dynastic and Akkadian period mainly the use of bent axis cella. Now, the central shrines would have a straight axis cella. Now, a straight axis cella basically meant that you could see the shrine from the door opposite to the main entrance. So for example, if you have a door, you will see that the shrine is located just opposite to that. So it's directly accessible. Now, some people say that this indicates a kind of direct access to the god without any intermediary or without any priestly intervention. On the other hand, you also have foundational peg figurines, which we will come to later. And we see extensive use of baked bricks. Now, in the earlier period, now remember that Sumeria and, so to speak, northern Mesopotamia also were very resource-starved areas and resources were not easily available. Baked brick is also something which was very expensive to acquire. And earlier, we did not see a lot of baked bricks being used in construction, but using baked bricks gives a certain kind of longevity to the structure. And the reason why Ur-Nammu uses a lot of baked bricks from this period, especially in the ziggurat of Ur, is probably to give it a certain longevity. And it tells us that these structures were politically also very important because they wanted these structures to be durable and to be remembered in future. And we have the cult of Nana, the moon god, who will recur throughout in the history of Ur. And we also look at cultic practices such as a sacred marriage. Now, this is the Vas of Uruk, which we have seen in Dr. Collins' lecture. And it shows a scene of the sacred marriage between Inanna and Dumuzi. The sacred marriage was one of the very primordial religious concepts of Mesopotamia, right from the old Babylon, old dynastic period. But in this period, the ruler enacts the sacred marriage in a way that gives him an additional power and authority. Now, under Ur-Nammu, as we know that the ziggurat of Ur was commissioned. So it is probably completed in the time of Shulgi. And much later, King Nabonidus of Babylon was the one who repaired the structure. So whatever superstructure that we see today was probably a restoration from Babylonian period, but the foundation itself was of the Neo-Sumerian period, and it doesn't really survive much. So a lot of speculation had to be done. Even Nabonidus thought that it was probably a 7-stage structure, and he really did a lot of speculative reconstruction of the temple. The temple is situated in an enclosed area at the northwestern end of the site. As I said, that there were 3 tiers, and there was a baked brick casing for each of the mud bricks. And they were huge in dimension. So the first tier itself had huge 62 into 43-meter dimensions, and it was around 11 meters high. So we can imagine that the others would have been in decreasing order, and progressively they would have gone, they would have kept decreasing. Now, so far as ziggurats are concerned, we do not have a lot of evidence about how the ziggurats were constructed and what was the geometry behind them. But we know that there were probably certain scribal schools where scribes were taught how to plan and how to architecturally execute ziggurats. So there are certain tablets which come from the later early Babylonian or old Babylonian period, where roughly we have the cuttings or outlines of a ziggurat. But it's very speculative on our part to be saying that, these were actual ziggurats, but maybe they were meant to be some kind of architectural plan for training. Now, this is the stela of Ur-Nammu, and this is a very important piece of document. It's fragmented. It was apparently found from the temple of Nanna and Ningal at Ur, and it was probably destroyed at the time of the sack of Ur by the Amorite invasions. However, we can see very clearly the figure of Ur-Nammu twice in the central register. So once he is consecrating the deity Nana, and once he's consecrating the deity Ningal. And this is when he's taking permission from the gods for the construction of the ziggurat. So we can see that the construction of the ziggurat is a divinely ordained task. On the next register, you can see Ur-Nammu as part of a group of people who are probably going forward to construct the ziggurat or lay the foundation stone. And here I have made a sketch of Ur-Nammu to show you closely that he's actually carrying some of the implements which can be used for laying the foundation. So Ur-Nammu is as an active participant in the act of construction, and the temple that he's intending to build is actually a part of his own agency. So we have another piece of inscribed brick. This is from the temple of Enlil at Nippur. And here, as the cuneiform reads, that Ur-Nammu is the one who built the temple. So we see the tendency of the king trying to commemorate his acts of pious donations and pious pious dedications to the god, and so that the posterity remembers him in a certain way. He has inscribed his own acts, and he has also portrayed himself in a certain way. Now, it is possible that Ur-Nammu didn't himself inscribe these things. Probably Shulgi was the one who commemorated these in remembrance of his father. The reason is because a lot of door jambs at the site of the temple have the name of Shulgi inscribed on them. So Leonard Woolley, the excavator, thought that maybe it is Shulgi who was the one who made these things. And these are the foundational peg figurines. Now, these are very interesting small figurines which were embedded in baked brick and mud brick casings at the site of the temple. Probably they were covered with a piece of cloth. And this is thought to be the figure of Ur-Nammu on the left. And the one on the right is thought to be the figure of Shulgi. So we know from the inscription on the left that this is actually Ur-Nammu. And as you can see that they're showing the ruler as carrying baked bricks on the head. So this probably tells us that the king again is shown actively in the act of architectural construction, and the king is actively taking part in the temple that he is dedicating to God. Now, so these are very few elements that I've highlighted because of the limited time, but over large, we can say that the Neo-Sumerian religion itself borrowed certain things, or rather continued certain things from before. So for example, the concept of peg figurines is something we see even in the early dynastic period. And we do not see that in the Akkadian period though. Similarly, the construction of ziggurat is thought to have some kind of precedent in elevated platforms, though ziggurats are very different in terms of their architectural plan and the kind of marvel that they show. Similarly, there were certain changes. So, for example, the use of the straight axis cella for temples is a major shift. Similarly, the growth of the royal cult of the king. So, for example, Ur was the site where Shulgi himself had created a royal palace, which later became the temple. Similarly, we also have the importance of cupbearers. So, people who were known as Sagi or Saga were engaged in making offerings to the gods or making offerings to the divine entity. So we can say that it is an amalgam of continuities and change, cultic practices that were borrowed from an earlier period, but maybe they were never carried forward into the early Babylonian period. And one can really talk into length about these things. So this is the nature of the archaeological record that we have, but it's pretty fragmentary. If we compare this with the extensive literary sources that are available from this period, so we have a lot of tablets, a lot of inscribed king lists, but very little in terms of iconography or votive figurines or cylinder seals showing or even structural remains that can really tell us what was happening in the Neo-Sumerian period. But it is very important to study these things in juxtaposition, because our literary sources or our textual sources and what we see in iconography has to go in hand. We need to have more archaeological, systematic archaeological exploration, and we need to try to understand how the ziggurats came about, and why certain deities became important in this period. And another significance of studying these religious practices, with which I'm going to conclude my session, is also that in the contemporary Egyptian civilization, we also see some similarities. So, for example, we have the cult of the princess, who is the server of the god. So, for example, the princess being nominated as the high priestess of the temple. This is something that has been worked on by some scholars. They have shown the parallels between the two. But Neo-Sumerian religious practices also have a lot of bearing on what was happening in a later period in the Achaemenid Empire and in the world over. So I think that is why the components of these religious practices and the religious landscape is very important for us to understand. Um, Thank you so much. This is a short bibliography that I have used for my presentation, and I would love to take questions, because that would help me discuss things further and in greater detail with all of you. Thank you so much.